Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. I'm Martha Kanter, CEO of College Promise, and we're here to talk with Willie Elliott and SOPHIA Nelson, two scholars from the University of Michigan, to discuss reimagining College Promise programs, a wealth perspective. Please note that we are recording this event. It'll be interactive, so please ask questions in the chat or leave comments, and we'll get back to you if we can't do it within the hour. And also, unless you're speaking, please keep yourself muted. That would be great. So we're going to talk today about the potential benefits of linking College Promise programs with children's savings accounts. With generous support from the Mott Foundation, College Promise has been collaborating with the National League of Cities and Prosperity Now, working together to raise public awareness and specific strategies like we'll hear about today that will integrate Promise programs with CSA children's savings programs across the nation. And if you'd like to stay connected and join our peer learning community, please send a note to my colleague, Michelle Cooper, who's on the line in the chat box, or via email at michelle@collegepromise.org. After Willie and SOPHIA share their overview of the policy brief, we're going to separate into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes for a more intimate discussion about the impacts of CSAs and College Promise, ways to integrate and implement them in our communities and regions. Then we'll come back and share key takeaways. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Elliott and his colleague, SOPHIA NIELSEN. Dr. Elliott is a professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. He's the founding director of the Center on Assets, Education, and Inclusion. It's called AEDI, and a nationally known leading researcher on children's savings, ways to reduce student debt, and address wealth inequality. Numerous news and media outlets, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, have featured his work. And in August 2018, Oxford University Press published his recent book, Making Education Work for the Poor: The Potential of Children's Savings Accounts. It's a landmark book that he published with Melinda Lewis that we hope you'll read. SOPHIA Nelson is a research associate at the Center on Assets, Education, and Inclusion at Michigan in the School of Social Work and contributes to research on CSA programs around the country. Previously, she served as a child welfare case manager in Wisconsin. She's a social worker. And though she began her career in that field, she's passionate about applying the lessons learned in the clinical setting to policy and program work at the systems level. She was born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she now lives and works in Washington, D.C. So let me turn this over to Willie and SOPHIA. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
So SOPHIA, you're going to introduce the story?
Yeah, so to start the presentation, we're going to step outside the box a little bit and try something different. We set up a recording of a chapter from Willie and Melinda's book, Making Education Work for the Poor. And hopefully the story will bring to life the argument that's laid out in the brief in a bit more narrative of a way. So Alexis, whenever you're ready, you can start that recording.
Why we may need to reimagine college promise programs. Melinda was born into a family of college-goers. Melinda's own college attendance seemed almost preordained. To redouble the advantages conferred by their social network, Melinda's family invested heavily in her intellectual development. She went to a fairly unremarkable suburban elementary school that nonetheless offered access to a selected gifted program and free transportation to get there. She spent most afternoons reading from the hundreds of books her family owned or the thousands more available from the nearby public library. When she took trips with her family every spring and summer break to visit museums and national parks, she got further ahead of her peers even when school was not in session. Her mom drove her to piano lessons, acting classes, writing workshops, and volunteer commitments of the sort that fill the resumes of high-income children, actions that mirror other privileged parents' educational investments. The advantages Melinda received as a child paved the way for a successful college career. As do many privileged students, she received college entrance exam coaching and took the preliminary Scholastic Aptitude Test as a practice as a freshman in high school. This gave her a leg up in the contest for a National Merit Scholarship. She also had the benefit of earning college credit from her honors classes so that she could enter college with sophomore status. The University of Kansas, KU, offered her a full scholarship as a National Merit Scholar, even though her family earned too much to qualify for need-based financial aid. Combined with other awards, she had enough aid left over to pay for a summer in Europe and trips to Latin America to study Spanish. She did not work for pay during her first year at KU, focusing instead on unpaid internships that helped to define her career direction and informed a compelling Truman Scholarship application. Although Melinda's family was not extraordinarily wealthy, they made investments in her education that are common for those in the middle class, but elusive for most of those in disadvantaged America. High-performing public schools, ample enrichment, and opportunities to live into a college-bound future from an early age. These actions made a difference. Crucially, they not only helped to determine her later outcomes, they also inadvertently hindered those who could not match her family's pace. If Melinda was almost certainly destined for college, Willie, as a child of color living in poverty, was a much less likely prospect. Willie grew up knowing that his parents wanted the best for him. Nonetheless, his family background placed him at a disadvantage when it came to preparing for college. His father had an 8th grade education and did not learn to read until he was in his 20s, while his mom had a high school diploma. His parents' education level was an important input shaping his own chances. Even beyond his immediate family, the challenges in Willie's former steel town placed him at a disadvantage. To start, Willie's school district was more impoverished than Melinda's. Although the district is not among the poorest in the country, today more than 77% of its students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, compared to only 38% in the district Melinda attended. Willie's teachers and administrators focused more on his prowess in the football field than on his learning. Their expectations for his future centered on athletics rather than academics. As such, they became currents against which he had to swim, rather than encouragement for his development. As is the case for many low-income students of color, Willie was not tracked into college preparatory classes or encouraged to take advanced placement courses. As is also common, Willie had little access to guidance regarding critical decisions about his future. He neither had classes to prepare him for college entrance exams, nor would have been able to afford such classes if they had been available. Melinda and Willie both completed college and even went on to graduate school. In some ways, then, their stories are not representative of the disparate outcomes that typically characterize the post-secondary experiences of poor students and their privileged peers. However, on the cusp of college and while pursuing their degrees, they experienced pressures and supports characteristic of their respective economic positions. In Willie's case, these dynamics could have easily derailed his degree pursuit, and indeed did delay it. He started college older than a traditional student. After dropping out of high school during his senior year, completing his GED, and starting a Christian mission at age 19, Willie's post-secondary education career began at Geneva College when he was 21. Geneva is a Christian liberal arts college in his hometown of Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. While many low-income students select institutions similarly close to home, Willie's decision to go to a private 4-year school rather than a less expensive 2-year option, such as the community college 10 miles away, went against national trends. However, Willie's faith drew him to Geneva, and his work and ministry experiences made the school willing to admit him, despite his poor academic preparation, when they might have rejected a similar student. Additionally, one of Willie's older friends from high school, who had attended a historically black college and returned to work in admissions at Geneva, put in a good word for him. Without these developments, Willie's only option, like many other low-income minority students, might have been a 2-year college. If he had received any counseling about higher education, that almost surely would have been the recommendation. Willie opted to live on campus and get a meal card despite the fact that his parents lived in town. This was also a somewhat unusual decision. Low-income students often live at home to save money, even though financial aid formulas can mean that this cost-cutting does not significantly lessen their budget strain. While living on campus raised the cost of attendance and Willie's student debt, it also made it much more likely he would graduate. At the time, his parents lived in a rental house, from which they would later be evicted, that had no gas heat or flushable toilets. His first year at Geneva, then, was the first time he had a truly supportive learning environment, with not only reliable food and shelter, but also exposure to people and ideas that challenged his mind. This context made previously unimagined options possible, including the notion of graduate school. Many of his classmates talked about graduate school as a logical next step, but prior to attending Geneva, Willie cannot recall even hearing about graduate school, let alone aspiring to attend. Melinda's route to and through higher education was notable primarily for its financing. For most Americans, completion of college begins with consideration of how to finance it. Privileged families are not immune from the reality of tuition increases. When Melinda was considering her options, the cost of attending a public university had risen dramatically from the tuition her sister had paid 7 years earlier. However, Melinda's family had ample resources to cover these additional expenses, so rising tuition had no effect on her decision-making. The fact that Melinda's family's savings and relative economic security allowed her to consider colleges based on her interests and their offerings rather than sheer affordability made her experience unusual. Even though her college career did not depend on it, she also benefited from the trend towards merit scholarships rather than those based on financial need. In contrast, Willie's financial aid story bears many of the signs of a student unprepared to bargain at the financial aid table. Unlike Melinda, Willie had no one to counsel him about what a good financial aid package looked like. Further, he had what appeared to be limited prospects, with a general education diploma, no savings, and parents without higher education. Melinda, on the other hand, came to the bargaining table from a position of power that ensured she got the best deal. Here, the two stories reveal that rather than equalizing opportunity, higher education, and in particular the way it's financed, often multiplies inequities. After a childhood of poverty, Willie had to study hard, make smart choices, and commit himself fully to what was an unlikely dream in order to position himself to climb through the post-secondary education system. This pursuit required more than his talent and efforts, however. It also required him to borrow against his future. This is the case for many low-income students, to whom U.S. financial aid policy extends not a hand up, but a pen out, awaiting signature on the promissory note that is their only hope. Even after receiving a financial aid package from Geneva, Willie grappled with unmet need, or the gap between the help he could get and the money he really needed. Melinda and Willie's stories serve to illustrate that divergent experiences are not primarily the result of different choices or preferences. On one hand, Willie's route to and through higher education was often perilous and frustrating, because he lacked the resources with which to maneuver and bend institutions in order to meet his needs. In contrast, Melinda's college aspirations were encouraged and rewarded by the same institutions because she had the resources to make them work for her. As stark as these different routes were, if the gaps in their family's wealth had ceased to matter once they got their degrees, some might still argue that higher education is working as a leveler, and that the right notion of free college is one that focuses only on paying tuition. Sure, Willie had to try harder, wait longer, and forego many opportunities, but isn't it where you end up that really matters? A college degree holder? Their story suggests that the answer to this question is a resounding no. Instead, their lives continue to be marked by the effects of wealth inequality and by the substantial differences in how the education system treats those who start with money and those working to get it. In Willie's case, even though it has been more than 10 years since he graduated from his PhD program, student debt still compromises his ability to leverage his relatively high salary to secure sound financial footing. His lingering financial instability is rooted in the economic disadvantages of his family of origin, but critically, it was not erased when he graduated. Instead, his imperative to confront his six-figure student debt deficit and assist his family ensured that the effects of wealth inequality would persist, despite his educational successes. Conversely, Melinda's consistent ability to rely on her family's assets through college and beyond placed her in a much better financial position than Willie, even though she has less education. In addition to graduating without any student debt, Melinda's continued access to her family's resources during her young adulthood meant that events like buying a new vehicle to accommodate the arrival of her twins, or coming up with a down payment sufficient to avoid costly mortgage insurance, were mere bumps in the road instead of substantial detours from a strong financial future. She was able to leverage her family's resources to advance her husband's upward mobility trajectory too, including when money from her grandparents helped to pay for some of his graduate degree. Before she turned 40, Melinda's family had resources to cushion them from future shocks, productive assets that grow each year, and bank balances that represent promises to their children. If financial aid dollars were truly created equal, two students who earn degrees in the same field from the same institution should realize similar returns. This is the effort plus ability equals outcomes equation that animates the American understanding of how the education system should work. It is not, however, how Willie and Melinda's lives have unfolded. It is not what millions of American college graduates realize as they accept both their diplomas and the stark truth that credentials do not pay off for everyone equally. While both graduated from the George Warren Brown GWB School of Social Work at Washington University, Willie with a PhD and Melinda with a Master of Social Work, the financial fruits of their credentials differ sharply. The effects of passed down wealth and student debt, or the lack thereof, continue to shape their economic prospects and their overall well-being. In some respects, Willie's story is the archetype of upward mobility, from a childhood spent entirely in or near poverty to his current standing as a well-regarded scholar. His children enjoy a standard of living far higher than his own at that age. They go to better performing schools, live in a nicer home, and have a clearer path to their own future careers. Willie has worked hard to get where he is now. It seems that those efforts have paid off, securing him a place among the reported 1.7% of Americans aged 25 and older who possess a doctoral degree. At the same time, all of this exertion has still not garnered true financial security and does not represent equality or what most poor people experience who attain a college degree. However, parallels in their paths make Melinda and Willie's stories useful illustrations of the ways that wealth inequality erodes education's equalizing potential. They both selected the same graduate school. They both distinguished themselves as successful instructors and respected researchers. All of these similarities notwithstanding, their balance sheets are highly divergent. Contemplating the resulting gaps, far too large to be explained by the minor differences in their respective choices in life, we are left with the conclusion that where they stand today must be strongly influenced by where they started and by the ways in which institutions amplified, rather than mitigated, those inequities. And this is one of the more hopeful stories where a poor kid completes college and ends up working at one of the most prestigious universities in the country.
Thank you for being willing to sit through that. It was a different way of trying to convey the same message, and hopefully one that many of you probably have seen and experienced yourself. And so hopefully that was some of you. So I'm going to give you a little bit of more traditional talk here before we start into our groups. One of the things we're emphasizing in that story is this idea that education is to be the great equalizer in society. At least we think of it that way. We invest heavily in it, where most countries have vast social service networks. We rely on college to a large degree, or education, to be that equalizer in society. However, children from lower wealth families are less likely to attend and complete college than their counterparts, which many of you know. Poor children earn less from their degree. Bachelor degree holders from low-income families start their careers earning about 1/3 less than those from higher income families. Minority children earn less from their degrees. Hispanic and Black American students with a degree have less income and net worth than their white and Asian counterparts. Degrees do not protect equally. During the Great Recession, Black and Hispanic college graduate families experienced wealth declines far greater than white families without a college degree. And sure enough, economists will be saying soon the same thing is happening during the pandemic, that these degrees do not cushion or protect minority families in the same way they protect other families. The unequal return on degrees suggests that strategies that focus only on college affordability will fail to achieve some of our most cherished aspirations for education to fulfill its role as an anti-poverty strategy or equalizer. It also means that where you start off in life matters, it continues to matter. And whether or not you have assets growing up matters for the types of outcomes you will be able to achieve and for whether education pays off equally for all. Parental investments help create unequal returns, but also point to a path for revolutionizing the financial aid system. Wealthy parents invest more in their children's education. Children of wealthy families are more likely to graduate from college, promoting cycles of poverty. Crucially, early parental educational investments turn into financial advantages in adulthood, as we discussed in the story. Research shows that predicted household income and net worth are higher for adults who receive parental financial support for college than for those receiving no such support. This support continues into early adulthood, importantly. While poorer children are unlikely to be able to turn to their parents for infusions of assets. Wealthy children can benefit greatly from such supports. Parental investments further augment the return degree possible by wealthy children. CSAs can, which are children's savings accounts, we're going to talk about here in a minute, mimic early parental transfers. While government investments that mimic early transfers from wealthy parents to their children might reduce wealth inequality, it is not at all clear that simply providing children with an education will do the same. So what is a children's savings account? It's interesting. There's a report that just came out in the from the government accounting office, and in it, they struggle with the definition of what a CSA is as well, and there's not a clear definition within the field as of yet. And I think college promise programs kind of suffer from the same thing, being a new type of field where there's not a clear set of principles or definitions. But essentially, children's savings accounts are some type of bank account or investment account that has usually initial deposit, sometimes financial education, and oftentimes a match, a 1-to-1 match, or up to a 5-to-1 match, depending upon what age the accounts start. They oftentimes start at birth. And there's been quite a growth in them over the last 5 years. Even within the last year, it was about a 55% growth in children's savings accounts that has occurred. And that is with states, in cities, and in some local areas as well. They've been started. Nevertheless, today's growing economic inequality means that small dollar CSAs, which I define as deposits between $5 and $1,000 are not enough, as promise programs well know. Low-income families have little discretionary money and will never be able to save enough to make up for their from behind start. These children compete on an uneven playing field against peers with entrenched generational wealth advantages. These wealth advantages are only magnified during periods of economic instability like we've been experiencing over the last several years. Early award scholarships. So moving from a promise of money to money in your account, combining promise programs with CSAs. Early award scholarships differ from traditional scholarships because they are not a promise of money in the future, but money children receive in their accounts at age prior to reaching college age. I'm going to digress, and I won't digress too long because I know I'm on a strict timeline here. So, which is relevant because I want you guys to have time to talk. It is important, and I have to give Patty Grant from the Promise Scholars of Wabash Community Foundation credit for thinking about the difference between kind of an early commitment scholarship, which is really around the literature and thought process around telling people that they might have financial aid available to them later, or giving them a promise of a scholarship. Someone who, in my story, certainly is not the worst in the world, and I'm not here to say that I've suffered anything huge, but growing up in poverty for a number of years, promises of money are far different to you than having some control over the money, having some access to the money, to have an early award scholarship where money is put into your account early on, largely because you grew up going to the checkout counter and not being able to check out and having to put your food back, for parents telling you you wait for Christmas and then Christmas comes around and you get nothing. So all these things make you kind of doubt these things in the future, don't allow you to develop kind of that future orientation. So what are some proposals? College Board proposal recommended supplementing the Pell Grant program by opening savings accounts for children as early as age 11 or 12, who would likely be eligible for Pell once they reached college age, and making annual deposits of 5 to 10% of the amounts of the Pell Grant award for which they would be eligible. So this is some ways for you to think about it in your little groups, about whether or not, about ways to think about putting some of that money into an account early on. Senator Booker's proposal is much larger. He proposes putting $1,000 into kids' accounts and then putting ongoing deposits every year until they turn 18 for low-income minority families. The question for us is, how might college programs be reimagined to mimic these proposals and leverage CSAs. The example of another example is in the Promise Scholars, which I mentioned with Patty Grant and her group. They initiated by the Community Foundation of Wabash County. The Promise Scholars Program seeks to further develop CSA programs by extending the Wabash Promise to students in grades 4 through 8 and providing them with opportunities to earn scholarships on a quarterly basis by satisfying objective criteria. So they can, and these are small dollar scholarships, like $100 here, $50 there, and they're able to earn these scholarships and then have that money put into their account. The important thing for us is that it's a scholarship programs that's beginning to think about how might we transition some of this early commitment money into actually early awards, where it goes into their accounts, they get bank statements, they're able to actualize and see that money grow. That program has further developed, and now they're going to put $1,000 cash deposit into the students' accounts. For those students who are enrolled in Wabash City Schools or St. Bernard's Catholic School in grades K through 4, students who enroll in Promise Linked Indiana 529 College Choice account, and those who sign a Community Foundation Early Award Participation Agreement. And so these students will get $1,000 put into their account. So it moved from the $50, $100, so now they're going to put $1,000 into these kids' accounts. So how might, and I'm going to stop here, early award college promise proposals benefit students? They provide a type of tangible hope. I like to think about it as a kind of a tangible hope. What is tangible hope? A lot of times we talk about aspirations and the difference between aspirations and expectations. Aspirations be what we desire, we want to happen. I give the example of my mother and I would oftentimes walk to a local neighborhood, and it was, you know, bigger houses, fancy houses, and we talk about how we would one day live in one of those houses. But we really had no plan for getting there, no reason to believe it would ever happen given our circumstances. That's the opposite of tangible hope. Yeah, we aspire, we hope for the American dream and those things, but really don't see a path that way, and so it doesn't change our behaviors, right? And so tangible hope is when students have access to a college promise program, they have access to a children's savings account, and they're able to begin to plan for their futures in ways they weren't able to before that. They have an actual strategy, a way of achieving their goal. To connect early education efforts with post-college outcomes. A lot of times when we think about our financial aid system or education system in general, even when we teach education, some people learn early education, some people learn higher education, but we don't have any connective tissue that goes from birth through schooling all the way post education. And so children's savings accounts can be, right now they're very restricted and thought about only for college, but really they could be beyond college for asset building throughout the adult's life. So the child would have that account early on, serve educational purposes. They didn't use that money by the time they reached age 25 for education. They could use it for other asset building activities like retirement, home ownership, and so forth. And really this kind of thinking about how education and financing education is affecting post-college outcomes is really, really important. Can help reduce the wealth gap. Research done by the Institute on Assets and Social Policy find that a universal progressive children's asset building intervention with initial deposit of $7,500 for low wealth households, incremental declines to $1,250 for the highest wealth households could close the wealth gap by 23%. And this is a much smaller program than something like Booker's program proposes. And it also strengthens the return degree. Right now, we have a real kind of problem in society with we are now questioning whether or not a degree matters, right? And we all know in this field that an education matters, even if it doesn't equalize outcomes, is important for a number of reasons. And people who have an education do better than those who don't. But if it ever is going to reach its more aspired to level, we have to begin thinking about how growing up with assets really matter in a capitalist society and help people to leverage that degree to use it in a way to benefit from it. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Willie. This has just given us a lot to think about. To save time, we're going to break up into two groups. We're going to have Michelle Cooper from our team and Anjana Venkatesan from our team moderate the two groups. Willie and Sophia will move from one group to the other to listen in and share, and the rest of us will be participating. So we have two questions scaled up for the groups. How can we strengthen the free college movement and college promise programs in particular to address the wealth gap along the lines of what Willie's saying, so that we'll get a better sense of how we can improve post-college returns? And then the second question is, how can we take the more than 330 college promise programs around the country and reimagine them to mimic these kinds of proposals and leverage the CSA work that has been going on now for the past couple of decades? So with that, let's go to the groups and reconvene. We'll be taking notes, and then Michelle and Anjana will share out from the groups when we get back together. Welcome back, everyone. We have two great facilitators. So we're going to have Michelle and Anjana give us a readout, and then we'll close out. And my clock says we have about 9 minutes. So if you could give us a few minutes, Michelle, and then Anjana, give us a few minutes of readout. And then maybe we can have, if we have a couple more minutes left, ask Willie to wrap, or I'll wrap. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Martha. And thank you all for the really fruitful conversations. I was working with the stakeholder group that had more folks from academia and policy, as well as some funders. And we were really holding on to this idea that Willie presented around aspirations and tangible hope. And, you know, the importance for folks to have tangible assets in order to help them move up the ladder, and, you know, how we can leverage college promise programs as well as CSAs to, you know, be a more gainful way to use the degrees. Also think a bit more about workforce development and building assets. And with CSAs, if integrated with college promise programs, but also standing alone, you know, they can really be a good way to, you know, help families build wealth and change the trajectory. We also, in terms of, you know, storytelling, Shira, you know, really lifted up how important it was to hear Willie and Melinda's story today, and how powerful it was, and, you know, how it shared, it really did a great job of, you know, asking why access and completion of college is so unequal. And that there's much more than, you know, just money or scholarships to adding to your life trajectory, that you need to build assets, and also to be building aspirations throughout your life cycle. And, you know, really just talking a bit more about how we need to hear more compelling stories throughout the field, how important that is. And I think a lot of times we're not hearing those stories, those personal testimonials, and they're incredibly powerful and really impactful. And we sort of ended on, you know, the fact that this is going to be a fight, but that we're in this, and that we can just, if we continue to have these conversations and continue to connect with leadership and the right resources, that we can you know, improve policy and hopefully continue to leverage these programs to be more impactful. I invite my, I'll have Anjana speak, and then maybe we can invite more conversation if we have time.
Thanks, Michelle. So I took the other breakout group, which was built around practitioners. So people who are on the ground helping students actively. And there's a lot of consensus in the group just around the idea that it really makes sense to be thinking as far downstream as possible when it comes to building wealth and support for these children, so that they can experience future success down the road. That being said, there was some conversation around the fact that it's not enough just to lump it onto these families. There really needs to be investment back into higher education too, because that threshold of what is unattainable is rising much faster than the ability of families to amass assets, or amass just even the amount of money that it would take to think about going to college. So programs really do need to be bold and invest in those low and moderate income families, but they also need to think about how they're investing in higher education to constrain the limits of the cost of education as well. There was also conversation around the fact that we need to think about wealth as a transformative lifetime change rather than just a thing that starts and ends in college. So achieving college enrollment or even a degree isn't the end of it. It's how do you carry that forward to economic mobility. And the idea that we need to consider the other social emotional learning needs that go into helping students make big financial decisions. So how do we build a community around talking about the choices and options students have? How do we make sure that they're thinking about these things much earlier on? So not only giving them agency, but also giving them education on the choices they're going to face. There also, in that same vein, needs to be better education on what all of the financial hardships are going to be. So not just talking about tuition and fees, but also letting them know much earlier on that they're going to be facing costs when it comes to things like transportation and housing and food. So really the entire bucket of costs that go into attending college or higher education. Then looking more specifically at promise programs, we had some discussion about the fact that promise and CSAs are really like the together as policy positions create these beautiful bookends. So CSAs engage students from the very beginning and help start that conversation and normalize conversation about post-secondary education. And they really give tangible benefits to the students that they can hold on to. It's not just lip service. And then college promise programs, again, kind of provide that push on the back end, like once they achieve a high school graduation, giving them the supports and the bridge they need to go on and have success in the post-secondary world. But a really big thing that people talked about in terms of kind of integrating them more thoroughly is moving some of the money that's already been invested in promise from that kind of like back end money of now that you've graduated high school, here's your tuition paid for, much earlier downstream so that it can be thrown into the CSAs and you kind of create this more integrated, streamlined process rather than these two separate bookends. There's also this concept of maybe expanding the concept of promise beyond just tuition and fees, because one of the things Willie talked about was the fact that it's that debt burden that really holds back students later in life. So being more explicit about helping students not just pay for college, but avoid taking on college debt. And again, I also welcome any of the members in my group to speak up and add anything I might have missed.
I think that was pretty comprehensive, thanks to Anjana and Michelle. We have a couple minutes left, so I'd like to turn it back to Willie and Sophia for any last minute, 1 or 2 minutes of what you'd like us to take away, Willie, as we close out this event. Is there one thing we can all do? What's the most important?
I think what the current administration has taught me, and probably have known it before that, is that winning the conversation is really important. Like, we can't be sitting on the back seat on defining what wealth transfer means to people, and whether it be the college promise or we put money early on, it's really a wealth transfer of some sort. And we haven't been able to talk about those kinds of things in public spaces very easily because we've lost that conversation. And so we really need to be aware of and push back against streams of thought that don't allow for us to talk about how does a wealth transfer connect to the American dream? How does it make the American dream more real? It is not anti-American, right? How does a free college program, how is that American in a way, right? How is that in engaging in those conversations and really trying to win some of those battles, I think it's really important. Lastly, I would say really in our own right, thinking about not getting so locked into our buckets about what is a scholarship, what is a CSA, and really thinking about how we might, if you put money in early on, is it still a scholarship, right? And I think that's what Promise Scholars has done well, is they've really thought about their scholarship money in a different way and how it could be used and how it could benefit people. I'll stop there. I know you have something to say. Thank you.
Well, it's 4:59, so I think my job is to thank all of you for coming, especially thanks to Willie and Sophia for all of the work to organize not only this, but the research in the center at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. And I hope all of you will reread the brief. We'll send you some slides Willie has prepared, and we look forward to really becoming, a larger network. Michelle at collegepromise.org can connect you, or Anjana, collegepromise.org, either one. And the work is going to continue. So I want to thank everybody, and We will see you again very soon. Thanks so much.